So this is what I want to discuss today. We're going to talk about elections. I want to start off by talking about them in context of the United States, because we just had an election day yesterday, but it also gives us a good inroad to points of comparison that we can make with the other countries that we can discuss. We can talk about how elections look in a few of these developing countries, some of the countries that we've already covered in class. But Terry brings up a very good point and a great place to start. We have this kind of concept in the United States, and it's not just a nebulous idea. It's backed up by voter turnout data. It's that goes back more than 5 decades now at this point. We have this idea that the important elections are the presidential elections, and then the midterm elections are just kind of the off year ones that don't matter as much. I see some of the logic, right? Because we're not electing the president. But as we've discussed in this class and worked on when we were examining the United States, is the president the single most important position in the United States government?
I want to say no. And also, we've seen, especially in these past elections, how I feel like, of course, I wasn't that into politics before 2020, because that's when I became eligible to vote. But I feel like a lot of Congress men and women started becoming more and more influential, and people started to know more about them, rather than just it kind of just being the president and then maybe the speakers of the House and Speaker of the House and Speaker of the Senate.
Sure. Absolutely. So we do have this important role being the president, and obviously there's a lot of significance to that role. It is, the leader of one of our branches of government. But we're seeing, I think, hopefully maybe seeing just more accurately now, that that's not all there is to government. That we have this extensive system of representatives, not just in the federal legislature, but also in state legislatures and all the way down to local governments, that really have a significant impact on our day-to-day lives. Oftentimes, much more than the president or the federal government even necessarily do. This is something that I think has, it has gotten, well, I'm not going to say that it's gotten out of whack. It has shifted in the past 2 presidential elections, right? With Donald Trump winning the presidency in 2016, starting in 2017, the 2020 election as well. Those were major watershed moments in how we view the president. Up until that point, we still saw this, massive turnout, more massive turnout. We've had middling turnouts in the United States since the 60s. So turnout is not a big, really since the 70s was when it started to drop off. So turnout, I don't think, is the best way to really look at, the effectiveness of our election cycle. But it's an important aspect to take into consideration when we're looking at how people view these elections. So we know that people view the presidential elections as more important, but as Perry points out, that also has, kind of created this idea that other positions were maybe less important, had less impact in our government, and we're really just now kind of coming back around to seeing that importance. On the one hand, for the way that these representatives and senators will back or not back the president of the United States, that is being put in much starker terms now than I have ever seen, than most people alive have seen in their lifetimes, because we are seeing this extreme animosity between candidates that is being brought on by a Trump era. Now, I'm as we discuss elections, obviously, starting in the United States, we are going to be kind of on that verge of discussing, direct political parties. I'm not going to sit here and advocate for one political party or another. I don't think that would be my position as, an instructor. And it doesn't really matter. Everyone voted yesterday. So, like, I'm not going to convince anyone to change one way or another. I don't want to. However, we have to look at the fact that in these past two election cycles, these past two presidential election cycles, we have seen a significant shift in the way each party engages with elections. One of the most fascinating things I saw, tuning in and out as much as I could / wanted to last night, watching the election results come in. So one of the most interesting things I saw was a chart that tracked the 2020 election deniers who were running for office. So those individuals who had publicly stated that the 2020 election had been stolen and that Joe Biden was not the rightful president of the United States. That concept that we have individuals running for federal government positions who deny the legitimacy of the previous presidential election is groundbreaking. That is new. That is something that we do not see in these kinds of numbers at any point in history, going back to the Civil War. Like, let's put it in those terms. So we are seeing new interactions and new perspectives being brought that place our representatives and senators in a new light and in a new level of significance that I think, to Perry's point, raises the significance of something like a midterm election, where these are very important, very instrumental elections to hold. Yeah, Perry.
First of all, I'm talking so much today. Sorry, I just love elections.
Yeah.
But when you were talking about politicians not who are running, who aren't in support of the 2020 election results. So this my roommate wasn't sure to vote for, so I organized a bunch of political information for her so she could have a simpler way to find it all. And most Republican candidates in the state of Wyoming had something on their website about either not agreeing with the 2020 results or wanting to kind of get rid of the mail-in ballots, that type of stuff, to further help Trump and their agenda, kind of. I think that was just an interesting thing that popped in my head when you said that.
Yeah, and that's weird. And I say weird. Weird's probably not the best term to use for it. I say weird as that is outside of the normative election discussion that we have, right? So I'm not saying that's weird as in it's something we shouldn't have. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I think that answer kind of falls along the lines of how you personally feel about the 2020 election. If we look at a purely data-driven analysis, the 2020 election was not stolen. I have to say that unequivocally, because I am an academic. I have to look at it from the perspective of what data exists, what evidence exists for, election fraud, any of the claims that have been made in even specific counties that suddenly stepped onto the national stage, counties out of Arizona, who I think their election campaign organizers were probably not happy that they were suddenly being thrust onto the national stage. we've seen, we saw this major shift in just the way we talk about elections around this idea of the election being stolen. Though that data doesn't exist, the conversation still does, and so I think for examining it in these terms, looking at an election in the terms of how it is functioning democratically, how our candidates are addressing it publicly, as Perry says, it has become now commonplace for members of the Republican Party to stake part of their platform on this major issue, the issue of the 2020 election, the issue of whether the 2020 election was legitimate or not. Another thing that I've seen that I think is really interesting and also relatively new in our political sphere is staking a position on the media, the legitimacy of mass media, and obviously that is again something that has become a dividing line between the two parties, where Democrats tend to at least express in their campaigning much more confidence in the legitimacy of the media, whereas opposed to it has become a very strong Republican running platform to question the legitimacy of mass media. So we see these things shift, and they are major issues with the electoral process and the democratic process itself, as opposed to what we might traditionally think of as policy issues that would be normative in our political discussion. And so, that's what I mean when I say, like, it's strange to see charts where we have individuals who are election deniers running for public office with that as part of their platform. That was not something we've ever banned. It's not that we prevented that from being the case. It was just not part of our national discussion until the past few elections, as to this real question of legitimacy in our electoral system. And it lays bare one of the issues that we have with elections. And I'm saying this within the United States as well as without. Elections in any country rely on one basic tenet, and that is that there is a general view among the people that elections are legitimate. If elections are not legitimate, and we have countries that we can look at to understand what happens for people when elections are not legitimate, just look at our discussions of Russia. Just look at our conversations around China. China holds elections. It holds elections primarily for localities. So localized positions like, mayor of a town may be elected in China. Oftentimes they are still not. The only true consistent elected position in China is just a local people's congress, and then those local people's congresses are tasked with selecting all of those other positions. That also works in a hierarchical fashion, moving from localities all the way up to moving from municipalities all the way up to the federal level of Chinese government. Each of these sections that we would see in the United States as something that we traditionally elect in a democratic fashion are not elected the same way in a country like China. Obviously, in Russia, they do still hold federal elections for a position like president, but those federal elections are not free and fair. election outcomes are already determined in Russia. And so the position of elections in those countries is very different. A lot of that change in Russia, after the attempts to essentially democratize in the early 1990s, a lot of that change has come from the belief amongst the majority of people that the elections are not being held in a way that is free and fair, that the elections have become corrupt in some sense. And so it is scary. I'll use the word scary. It is scary in a democratic system to see such a prevalence of individuals who will question the legitimacy of the very elections that put them in their positions of power. That is not something we expect to see in advanced democracies of the world. It is something that maybe we expect to see in developing countries. And I think that that's a bit unfair, right? That we tie this kind of election legitimacy to a certain class of country around the world when we're talking about comparing them. So it is a shift, and we are seeing this. I don't think it should be surprising to hear that we are seeing a significant shift towards this very polarized version of American politics. But what's more, and what is concerning about that, is that those shifts are bringing with them doubt in the electoral system itself. One of the ways that I think we can really analyze this change, and it has come to more prevalence now than I think it ever had before. But there are resources online that track litigated election fraud, if you will. One of the best and most consistent of those is an organization called the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is a conservatively minded think tank. They are very open about their conservative leanings, and so they try to track and publicly publish all instances of voter fraud that have been brought to litigation. So anyone who has been charged with voter fraud by a county clerk in the country, and then the outcome of that is published on a central website. I think that that's something that's very helpful. It's also very helpful to see if you are personally concerned about the amount of voter fraud that's happening in the country. It's also very reassuring to see that, because seeing, kind of these legitimate cases, these well-documented cases, and just how few there are in the history that, at least the section of history that the Heritage Foundation has been tracking, which I believe is since around 1979. So now, yeah, that makes me feel old. So like what, 40 years now of election tracking. We're looking in the range of a couple of thousand instances of voter fraud, which sounds like a lot. Like, obviously it would be lovely to have 0 instances of voter fraud in the country, but when we're talking about a couple of thousand of instances of voter fraud over elections that, even if those all happened in a single election, that's out of more than 100 million voters. So that is, infinitesimally small and well dealt with, for the fact that these are something that are, these are numbers that are published. These are instances that are openly available for us to view. So there should be, I hope, some reassurance that the instances of voter fraud are not actually taking place and are not influencing American elections. But the danger resides in those individuals who will still question the legitimacy of the elections, even after they are brought to office by those very elections. And so this, is something that, again, I think that we don't expect to see in the United States as a fairly stable democracy. We're not a perfect democracy. We are, by the International Democratic Index, we are a flawed democracy, and it is due to some of those effects, some of those questions of the media, our questions of free speech that we have been addressing, recent movements by the Supreme Court, things like that, that influence our exact ranking in our overall democracy. But it's not something that you expect to see in our elections. So what do elections look like in other countries? What do elections look like? How are they different in other countries than we see here? And how does that influence our understanding of those other countries? I'll put that. Are there any countries that you want to discuss? Or I may put you on the spot, Reese. I know that you have family in the UK. If maybe you want to talk a little bit about elections there and how that goes, we can talk about how elections look in some of these other countries. Logan, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, Brazil just had their election, so it's a great,
Yes.
I think it's a great comparison, just because I guess not so much with this cycle, but specifically this cycle in the US, but the last cycle in the US, how it took, we still don't know the full results, but I feel like in 2020, we still even knew a lot less at this same point, but Brazil, on the other hand, they knew within hours, who had won the presidency. And I guess just comparing, I guess what I mean to say is that I saw a lot of conservatives on Twitter saying, well, why can't we be like Brazil? This is it's gone so fast. But I think what they're failing to realize or express to their followers that our decentralized election system is part of what makes it take so long to count the votes, because they do a more of a federal election system where everything is administered from a top down, and they have more one system, where in the United States, you pretty much have 50 different systems of voting. There are different rules in every state, maybe not exactly 50, because I'm sure a lot of states are very similar, but arguably a way more different systems of voting. And when that is the case, it's just going to take a little bit of extra time. And then there are other things I don't know, we saw in the lead up to the 2020 election, states even such as Pennsylvania passed laws regarding in what order mail ballots versus in-person ballots should be counted, and when the mail ballots can be started to even being counted. So it's I feel yeah, so that's just an interesting comparison, between Brazil, a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach to counting votes, and how many different laws. Because I guess part of the strength is the fact that we have a decentralized voting, because that also does make it harder to steal on a national level, because there's a lot more people watching it. I don't know, that just kind of rambled, but those were my thoughts.
No, some very good points in there. Absolutely. I think one main point of comparison to pull out of that is the speed of election results. We are sitting now the day after midterm election, and we have very, very secure, very sure election results from all 50 states. We know the outcome of yesterday's election. And you compare that to 2020 in the United States, where we didn't, because we have this, sorry if there are any huge fans of the Electoral College sitting in the class, but we have this absolutely effed up system called the Electoral College that helps us decide who the president is. It's outdated. I've written about it. If you want to discuss or tell me I'm completely wrong and defend the Electoral College, by all means, feel free. I'm happy to chat with you about it in an academic sense. But we have this system in place that makes our presidential elections take significantly longer before we have a for sure answer. It is, I think, ironic that you mention, or sorry, I shouldn't say, it is somewhat ironic for Republicans at this point to talk about how our, election system should be more like Brazil's so that we have faster answers, because the actual research on the Electoral College shows that it does tend to favor Republican candidates for president. And that's, just I think one of those data sides of things where if they were looking at that, if they were considering that in term, they may not be as big a fans of the electoral process as it happens in Brazil, because it does tend to disfavor more conservative. The electoral college, or the electoral college tends to favor those more conservative Republican voices, whereas the electoral system in a country like Brazil tends to just favor slightly more progressive or slightly more liberal candidates. And so, something like that, something like this desire for a speedy outcome. I will mention the United States is the only country that has an electoral college. So you will see election results from almost every other country do come out significantly faster than a presidential election in the United States. And that's something that tends to be a point of confusion. We have seen that where other countries are often confused as to why it takes so long for us to actually decide who our president is, when they see in their own country, even a country like Brazil with such a massive population, can vote accurately with confidence in a matter of hours, that they have a result of those elections. And Logan is also right, because we have our system that is very diffuse. We do not have a unitary election system. We have this devolved system of elections that essentially results in 50 different election systems, with little tiny differences. And it's not an exaggeration to say that, because you have, especially as mail-in ballots have become more prominent, because, or at least in the discussion, they've become more prominent because of COVID. Mail-in ballots have always been a part of our elections. We have, like, it's not like they're new. We've had the ability to vote by mail literally since before World War I. So, to act like this is a new problem is kind of misrepresentative, but it has resulted in this system in which these 50 different ways of counting, and when you start counting mail-in ballots, how that affects this horse race that we've developed of like watching on election night for the results. And they start calling elections at 40% of the vote coming in. It has created this kind of media centric version of elections where we care more about that race than actually getting an accurate election result as to who it is that has won. And it's meant for systems in which we see more of a distinction between the two major parties, right? That kind of horse race works very well when someone wins by a landslide. It does not work as well when we see a vote outcome like we saw from Georgia last night in the Senate race. So this, overall kind of back and forth that we are experiencing is very different, and does make it difficult for us to say, oh, well, why can't we just have election results as quickly as Brazil does? Well, it's because our entire system is set up to not give election results as quickly when it comes to a presidential election, as other countries very comfortably do. So Brazil, great point of comparison. Also, hopefully, just a small anecdote to give you a laugh. A couple of years ago, in this class, I was talking about the election in Brazil, after Jair Bolsonaro had won, and I made a comment about me, like I unfortunately inserted some of my personal politics and said that I thought that Bolsonaro was a terrible choice for president of Brazil. And then I realized I had just said that in front of a class of like 60 people and was like, oh, I hope I didn't offend anyone. One of my students raised their hand and said, I'm from Brazil and am a fan of Bolsonaro. Like, I am so sorry that I said that out loud. And then I talked with him afterwards. It was fine, but that is one of the challenges of teaching a course like this, as we discuss these international candidates. Other countries to throw out there, even if you don't know a ton about their election system. I may know something. If I do, I can interject. I can put it out there. Any countries, as far as developing countries, that still hold elections, but maybe are more or less legitimate in their view of what we see.
I don't know how much, like, I don't know too much about this. It just popped in my mind when you said it. But I remember last year there was a coup in Myanmar. And I remember it was like after the first, like one of like the first Democrats was elected, and it just like popped my head. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that was messy. Not Lionel Messi, not the footballer. That was a very messy situation in Myanmar. And had to do a lot with corruption of the views of corruption, and somewhat similar to in the United States. Sometimes it doesn't matter whether the individual is necessarily corrupt or not. It is that public image of if you can convince the population that an individual is corrupt, then it takes away from legitimacy of an entire government, of an entire political party, of an entire regime. So yes, that was a pretty big issue in Myanmar. Have they had a recalled election since that? I'm trying to remember. Perry, I'm not sure if you know or not.
No, I don't know off the top of my head, and I Googled it trying to see if I could find anything, but I don't really see any new things. I think it's still just kind of military run.
Yeah, because they put it under, it after the election questions and everything that happened. It went under military control. I think they were going to have emergency elections sometime this year. And then I don't know if that actually ever ended up happening. So I think the takeaway maybe of that, something to consider in these different political systems that we see. The United States has a very set election schedule, right? That every 2 years there's an election in the United States. If we ever suspended an election, that would be, that would just be downfall of civilization. I think that would be an utter undermining of our democratic system, because we rely on the fact that every 2 years we have elections. Not everyone is up for election every 2 years, obviously. Senators serve on a 6-year term, presidents serve on a 4-year term. So we have this, in and out rotation of these different positions, but we have a very set schedule. That is not the case in a lot of parliamentary systems, like Myanmar. You have the ability for governments to be dissolved, depending on which system you're in. That typically tends to fall with either the prime minister or the president. Often in a lot of parliamentary systems, has the ability to dissolve the government and call for a new election. So we see that, I think lend a little bit of instability to the system. In some places, sorry, that doesn't lend instability to every system, though. In some places, that security, places like Germany, for instance, that level of security, I think, helps to guarantee the legitimacy of the government. So in Germany, the stability is brought by the fact that government can be dissolved if it doesn't reach consensus, or at least I just lost the word. If the different parties don't form coalitions, there we go. If that coalition, that necessity for a stable government, is not formed, then the government can be dissolved and reelected. And that in Germany has given it a significant amount of stability. However, that same ability to dissolve and reelect government has left Myanmar where now it doesn't have a true democratic government. It is being run by the military. So it's a knife's edge for different countries as to whether some of these systems function as intended, or if they function as they shouldn't, as they can lead from a democratically written constitution into something like military control. Unfortunately, most of the time when the military takes control, it doesn't usually go back very easily to democratic elections. However, there are exceptions to that statement as well. Egypt is a great example of a country that has gone in and out of military control at different points. I saw Perry wrote in the chat, is that similar to the system of France at all, with their system being destroyed and reformed each time major conflict breaks out? Yeah, that's sort of normalized in France, which is again just a fascinating point of comparison, right? If the United States, every time a political conflict broke out, dissolved its government and reformed it, as often as France tends to do, I think that we would go crazy. And that I think speaks to just the mentality in France around their governmental system and around legitimacy deriving not from the consistency or reliability of any individual, but of the democratic constitutional system itself in France. And then suggests a petition to rewrite the Constitution every time a major conflict breaks out. Yeah, sure. It's probably, the Constitution's probably out of date at this point. If you have heard me talk in elections classes or in like Polls 1000 or anything like that, you've probably heard me say that I think as a country, the thing we are most afraid of in our Constitution is trying to fix it. There are two main paths under the US Constitution. So I don't want to make this all about the US. There are two main paths under the US Constitution to form amendments. And one of them, as we talked, no, we did talk about this, I remember, because we had one successful use of it since the formation of the country, and that is the, calling of a state constitutional convention. That kind of system speaks to the fact that we are very afraid to rewrite a new constitution. Countries like France are not afraid of that. Honestly, in France, I think they change it as much as you would like to change jobs in your career, which is, you start to get that itch about every 2 to 5 years. You just want to write a new one. So it's different systems that function in different ways. I think I briefly mentioned Egypt. I just want to talk a little bit about one aspect of Egypt that I think is really interesting. Egypt, as well as several other countries, have compulsory voting. In Egypt, it's not very effectively implemented compulsory voting. However, you can put Egypt up beside a country like Australia, which has compulsory voting as well. And in Australia, the compulsory voting is very well implemented. In Australia, they tend to have around 94% turnout in elections. The Australian government and the Australian people make a strong argument that the legitimacy of the government there is based on that turnout. That if you have the overwhelming majority, if you have over 90% of your population voting, that gives the government stability and legitimacy that other countries with, optional or not well implemented voting tend to have. So I'll throw this out as a potential question. Is the fact that in the United States, we tend to see between 55 to 65, somewhere in there. That's the percentage of eligible voters that we see turn out at most of our elections. Does the fact that just over half of eligible voters actually vote, does that contribute to some of these feelings of illegitimacy? Or is that something that maybe we should look at fixing to increase the legitimacy of our electoral system, as other countries have done? What are your thoughts on compulsory voting?
I'm personally against it because it can lead to, especially for like local races, people just coming in very uninformed.
Sure. Yeah, Matthew.
Arguably, though, on the other side of that, it could mean that we'd have a more informed electorate year round, because you have to anticipate going to vote every single year or every single time an election comes up. In the US, that'd be every 2 years. I'm not for nor against it, but I know that there is a bill going through Congress right now to make Election Day a federal holiday, which would give more opportunity to people to vote. Because arguably there's a percentage of the population that just doesn't go to vote because they don't have the ease or ability to do so, even with legislation being about where jobs are supposed to give you the hour off to go vote.
Yeah, I feel that I had to find time as well as find my voting location here, and that took surprisingly long. It was surprisingly difficult to find out where I was supposed to vote, and I obviously exist as a better informed than most, as most of you are, since you're in this class, a better informed than most voter. And yeah, there were still hurdles, still challenges that it made a lot of sense that it's very difficult for people to overcome that, and to have the desire to overcome that necessarily. Yeah, Perry.
I was just gonna add to the conversation that I think a continuing theme that's been talked about so far has been about voter participation. So in my mind, it's less like I think we should make voting like as a required thing, so everyone's able to actually make sure that their voice is being heard and they're adding their 2 cents. But I think there should also be required information about each candidate that provides like a simple instruction so people who aren't as informed have like they don't feel as intimidated when it comes time to voting. Like I know one of my friends it was their first time voting and they're like, oh, I had to vote for all these people and I didn't really want to, but I didn't know anything about the other people. So just kind of like I said, like providing more information for people that's not like in a class like this.
Sure. Yeah, that information component is still a struggle, especially if you don't receive the newspaper, which saying that in our generations is like nails on a chalkboard. But the fact that our that level of information, in Wyoming, the League of Women's Voters puts together local candidate summaries for every election, but that doesn't mean that they're easy to find because you need to find a newspaper to get it. That is a difficulty implemented by our very diffuse election system, that information isn't always readily available. Ven.
I think there is something to be said about the fact that people who currently don't vote, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them don't vote simply because they don't want to. And so I think a couple of the dangers with compulsory voting, right, is number one, voting is a right, just like the right to bear arms. If people were forced to own guns, it wouldn't be a right anymore. If people are forced to vote, they no longer have the right to vote. That's something they're required to do. And so it would almost reinforce what's already becoming a very populist style of elections, because forcing people to vote isn't going to make them go educate themselves. It's just going to encourage them to vote for whoever they happen to see the name of so they can get it over with because they never wanted to vote in the first place. So it could definitely reinforce almost voting for the popular candidate purely because you don't want to take the time to research or vote at all. You're being forced to. And so it's not a right anymore. Now it's just kind of a necessity.
Sure. Yeah, it may have that outcome as much as it has the hopeful outcome, I guess, that people would become more informed. There is just as much a chance that it will reinforce that reluctance to do so. And as we see, I mentioned earlier kind of this comparison of Australia and Egypt as two countries that both have compulsory voting. I think we see each of those outcomes represented because in Egypt, belief that the elections are illegitimate tend to lead to only around the same amount of people, well, the same proportion of people, as we see in the United States actually voting. So even with compulsory voting, Egypt tends to see around a 60 to 65% turnout. And that's just because of poor implementation. So yeah, there is certainly a chance there as well that it would not have that result. All right, Matthew, finish us off and we'll wrap up for the day.
On this is just building upon that conversation once more. In regards to getting people wanting to vote or educated to vote, a really cool idea I pinged off of my personal representative for the House of Representatives here in the state was change the voting age. Let's get them started in high school. Let's implement a civics class that deals with current issues, current pop culture of what are the issues going on in the state at the moment, and maybe start them with only being allowed to vote in local elections, or as far as I'm concerned, go ahead, give them the ability to vote all the way up to the presidency. But if we get them involved at the age of, say, 16, as opposed to 18 when they're getting dropped in the middle of, starting college and figuring out their lives, I feel like we'd get a much better ratio of educated voters and better voter turnout moving forward.
Not a bad idea. All right. Well, great. Thank you for that discussion. We will discuss next week. Well, I'll leave you to your discussion this week. Please submit your questions and look forward to your discussion with Will on Friday. Next week, I'll see you on Monday for delving into India, which actually I think is a good lead off from this conversation, as India has the largest voting population in the world. So cool. I will see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to make sure I read Logan's comment before you. Was it that just because voting is compulsory, it doesn't mean that everyone is gonna vote? Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. I think that was a nice discussion to have.
Yeah.
Cool.
For sure.
I'll stop recording.